Hello you vampy lot, welcome back to my therapeutic analysis series of The Vampire Lestat. We are on episode 2 today. I need to warn you, I have so much to say about episode 2. I have so many thoughts. I genuinely had to cut down some of my notes in order to not make an hour-long video on just episode 2. I mean, it's only the second episode and they are revealing so much about Lestat's trauma and upbringing and childhood. There's so much to say about Gabrielle. And also, I know that they've changed her name in the show to Gabriella, but I have always known her as Gabrielle from the book, so I will just be calling her Gabrielle. Before I get started, I just wanted to say a massive thank you to all of the community members that have already reached out about the first episode, who are commenting, who are reaching out on like DMs and socials to me to kind of discuss a lot of the themes that we spoke about and explored in the first episode. So I am just truly grateful. And to anyone else that is joining the journey of my therapeutic analysis, I am so excited to have you here and explore and discover all of the new themes that are going to be coming our way. If you haven't seen the first episode of my analysis, I really recommend just going back and watching that before this one. And just before we get started, I want to give a quick disclaimer. Today we are going to be talking about some distressing themes such as abuse, trauma, which some people might find distressing. Please take care of yourself, and if at any point you find the video content is overwhelming or bringing up some distressing emotions for you, then please check in with someone that you trust and please reach out to the mental health professional services within your area. I'm going to dive straight into episode 2 because that is exactly what I feel like it did. It threw us into the deep end. The episode opens with Lestat referencing Freud's Oedipus complex theory. I'm not going to talk about that or go into that because actually in modern psychology, this theory isn't really something that we tend to use as an explanatory model anymore, just because we've got more advancements in the way attachment works and the way that relationships are much more complex. I think Lestat is immediately telling us about what's to come in terms of them exploring the deeply blurred lines in Gabrielle and Lestat's relationship. And naturally, to do that, we have to start with Lestat's early years, which they touched upon in the very first parts of the second episode. There is really so much that we can learn about a person when we understand their upbringing and their childhood. Lestat tells us that it's 1772. He is the son of an aristocratic family, which is now in decline. So before we've even met Lestat, we are introduced to a family system built on status, appearance, and preserving an inherited identity of principles and expectations. I even found myself immediately drawn to the behavior of Lestat's father and brothers at the table during dinner. You know, that they're feasting on this lavish banquet, exchanging kind of barbed remarks at each other and displaying what we might associate kind of behavior with, you know, masculinity. It almost feels theatrical, doesn't it? And for me, you know, it's as if this family, or at least the father and the brothers, they're trying to perform to each other, desperately trying to uphold this family image, which is quietly falling apart beneath the surface. Lestat also introduces us to grief, a big theme of grief already. He says that he's lost 5 siblings. I think we're even shown the grave. Not only is the family system kind of being shaped by this decline in repertoire, they're also shaped by bereavement. I could theorize a family whose identity is centered on, you know, inheritance and lineage. Repeated child loss, you know, probably wouldn't just install grief within the family. I can theorize that it would have added a, you know, big pressure to preserve appearances, creating this family culture where vulnerability is really difficult to express. So we're going to unpick the dinner scene in a lot of detail. Alongside this kind of unspoken decaying of aristocratic status, we meet a very young Lestat. And I already picked up immediately on young Lestat's body language. He looks so anxious, doesn't he? So distressed. He's like playing with his food, pushing it around. What I really notice about him is that you can tell he's really withdrawn from the environment around him. It looks like he's almost trying to make himself small and less visible to his family members in the room. From a polyvagal theory, we might understand this when we're talking about fight or flight responses. And there's one when our body is in a kind of what we would say a state of shutdown. It's not uncommon to go into a freeze mode, you know, an immobilization mode where your body goes, okay, if we don't move, if we don't do anything, the threat won't see us and it will go away. We often see this in children, you know, when there's no way for a child to escape a situation or communicate the distress that they feel. Often you'll see children they'll freeze, they'll withdraw, they'll try to make themselves smaller and less noticeable. And to truly highlight Lestat's current nervous system immobilization due to fear, we have his brother cut in and ask him, are you a good boy? And I feel like this truly contrasts the very boisterous behavior at the table, doesn't it? The question in itself very much feels like it's trying to ridicule Lestat, who is already trying to avoid attention. We could also interpret that a question induces feelings of shame. You know, it highlights to a child that their safety in a situation is dependent on their behavior, their obedience, or their performance. And performance, we could surmise, is already a bit of a coping strategy for the family. It just kind of presents itself in different ways for each of them. In the book version of The Vampire Lestat, in the kind of first chapter of those early years, young Lestat actually talks a lot about being good. He becomes quite obsessed with morality, good versus bad, you know, being a good person. We could understand that if most of the interactions with his family echoed this, I suppose you would quickly attach beliefs around being a good person equals being safe. And we are shown Lestat's speech impediment, which his brother makes fun of. It's important to say that speech impediments can have many causes, but we do know that stress and anxiety can kind of further the difficulty with them in certain situations. To imagine that also when Lestat tries to express himself, he's also ridiculed and made to feel unsafe with that. There's so many compounding factors here for his nervous system to make him feel like, he shouldn't be in this environment. Who is there at the table to defend Lestat? We meet Gabrielle. Lestat shares that he feels that he and his mother had an allyship. And you can see this particularly when they're both kind of labeling the other family members as cabbages. And I feel like this is a way in which Gabrielle attempts to disconnect her and Lestat from the others entirely. For a young Lestat who clearly doesn't feel very safe with the other family members, you might understand that this would feel like a safe relationship, or this allyship would feel like safety. But we have to recognize that even at this point, healthy parents, or parents with kind of healthy behavior, would not recruit their children into emotional alliances. So at this point, we're already seeing that Lestat's role as the child is expanding inappropriately, either into being, emotional support for his mother, or being weaponized for Gabrielle herself against the other family members. And one of the first things that really stood out to me for Gabrielle is the fact that she's reading at the dinner table. This feels really psychologically significant. It feels like a small act of resistance or rebellion, doesn't it? Understandably, as a woman in the 18th century, Gabrielle would not have had much agency. Like many other women, her life would have been determined by the men around her. There was no sense of autonomy and very little control over her own futures, her own desires, and over her own body. Her value would have been really closely linked to her ability to marry, conceive children. I theorize that Gabrielle would have been forced to sculpt her identity within the socially acceptable boundaries of that time, meaning that maybe there were certain aspects of her identity that she could never fully integrate with. Yet Gabrielle, she appears fierce, doesn't she, with a massive thirst for knowledge. And it's not something that she hides, despite, their many attempts to ridicule her, or, her son at one point removing the book from her physically. The book in itself feels like a shield from her husband and her sons. For me, I really interpreted this as her refusing intellectual invisibility. Not only is she comparing these men to cabbages intellectually, she demands to be recognized as a woman capable of thinking and questioning and challenging. I really feel, watching as a woman, that she would feel minimized to her sexual characteristics. But I have a deeper theory into her trauma. And it's something I do feel is really important to discuss sensitively. Lestat comments that Gabrielle had asked the midwife to cut her in the womb so that his father could not humiliate her any further. As a clinician trained in intimate partner violence, it's difficult for me to not explore Gabrielle's experience through the lens of bodily autonomy and consent. In the context that we've discussed, we have to remember that women did not have control over sexual intimacy, and the concept of consent was very different to what we consider consent today. Whether or not the writers intended for Gabrielle's experiences to appear to be non-consensual or across of boundaries, for me they're really presenting a woman who feels as though her bodily agency has been completely defiled. Interestingly, Lestat at this point actually reflects on something very similar in the novel. I've tried not to lean too heavily on the source material because I am just interpreting the show, but I think Anne Rice's own words here offer some valuable insights into understanding Gabrielle's psychology. The years and years of suffering and loneliness, the waste in those damp hollow chambers to which she had been condemned, and the books that were her solace, and the children who devoured her and abandoned her. It emphasizes to me that motherhood and perhaps the conception of her children was deeply traumatizing for Gabrielle. It was an invasion of her very self. Any form of bodily violation, but particularly prolonged experiences that repeatedly cross boundaries, undermine autonomy, or occur without consent, can profoundly alter a person's relationship with their own body. Trauma has the capacity to create a deep sense of disconnection, where the body no longer feels like a place of safety, but instead becomes associated with fear, humiliation, or a loss of control. For many survivors, the body doesn't really feel safe anymore, and it becomes a place where trauma is carried and remembered. Outside of the deeply troubling themes and complexities between Gabrielle and Lestat, which we will go into detail more later, we can still hold compassion for Gabrielle here. She sees her body through a traumatized lens, and it's understandable that she craves freedom from her own body. And there's further evidence of this. I really picked up on the language that Gabrielle uses in these family scenes. She repeatedly describes intimacy in very graphic and dehumanizing terms. For example, she tells her son something about him shoving his into the maid like he's sausaging pork, and elsewhere she reduces the men at the table to acting from their sexual organ. There is very little association for Gabrielle with the male identity and affection or tenderness or mutuality. Instead, at this point in the story, any male-related connection is described almost entirely through the lens of the body, stripped of any emotional connection. Through a trauma-informed lens, and given everything that we've discussed around Gabrielle's experiences, I wonder whether it reflects not just a repulsion or distrust towards men, but a profound alteration in the way that she views intimacy and bodily connection, which, can be really common when you've experienced trauma like that. And so all of this fuels a profound survival response in Gabrielle. And for me, it's actually quite an intricate one. Lestat describes her as cold in some moments. I think he says at one point she was like beauty behind a glass. But actually, I see Gabrielle moving between different emotional states quite quickly. At times, Gabrielle appears to, shut down, be very withdrawn. Being present in her body feels so unbearable. But at other times, we see the opposite, intense emotional reaction and impulsivity, anger and volatility. All of that internal distress is expressed outward. And these aren't necessarily contradictions. They can be two different ways of surviving overwhelming experiences. The tragedy is that for Lestat and the other children growing up with a caregiver like Gabrielle, they would not have understood the context or the trauma underneath those responses. Children aren't able to sit there and say, oh, okay, I think my mother's dissociating because of her trauma that she's been through. They experience it as, my mother's here, but she isn't available to me. And this creates a really confusing attachment environment. If we think about it, we learn emotional regulation through our parents. If you're distressed, you're going to be focusing on that either parent or caregiver will notice that you're upset, respond, and help your nervous system return to calm. But I think I mentioned this in episode 1, when a caregiver is, emotionally inconsistent, emotionally absent, or maybe the opposite, really emotionally volatile, the child struggles to create a stable sense of self with that and know what to do when they're experiencing distress themselves. And so this is where we might see the foundation of something called disorganized attachment, if you're into attachment theory. The person a child instinctively turns to for support and comfort is also the person that they cannot consistently rely on for it. For Lestat, Gabrielle is one of his biggest sources for validation, for attention, but also is probably one of the biggest sources for his wounds. So for me, it is not unexpected that when they have the dinner scene of the town folk coming in and asking the family for help with the wolves, Gabrielle is the first to react with such anger and volition. You are supposed to be men. That's all you do. It's all you talk about, how you're men, and now it's time for you to be men and really show up, And Lestat immediately rises to the challenge. He seeks out that validation from Gabrielle immediately. He's like, I'm not like these cabbages. I'm a real man, Gabrielle. I'm a real man. I'll show you, mum. You can rely on me. But the wolf attack, I have so much to say about the wolf attack. I feel like this is a huge pivotal turning point for Lestat. This is psychologically his first confrontation with imminent mortality. Up until this point, his suffering has been largely relational. His father's cruelty, his brother's cruelty, his family's rejection, the restrictions placed upon him, to his nervous system, it would feel like danger, it would feel like a threat, but it wouldn't feel, I suppose, the same as imminent threat to life as a pack of wolves almost killing you. This is where we can really begin to understand Lestat and this experience of becoming the wolf killer through a PTSD lens, or post-traumatic stress disorder. An event of threat to life creates an extreme biological emergency. The brain goes into such a state of, early survival mode that it suspends normal processing functioning to focus on survival. And not to get too brainy and complicated with my neurobiology stuff, but because the brain has turned, activity away from kind of memory processing and other areas to focus on, like the amygdala, which is, one of the centers for adrenaline to help us survive a threat. Because it does that, after the event, the brain struggles to, let's say, file away the memory in the hippocampus. And so the event becomes like a fractured, stuck memory. And this is what leads to PTSD symptoms like flashbacks and nightmares, because your body is responding literally as if the event is happening again. And at this point, we don't necessarily need to hear it from Lestat that he is at death's door, that his brain, is completely in a state of shock and paralysis. In the novel, after he kills the wolves, there is a lot of inner dialogue in which he describes this darkness after the event, and he becomes really overwhelmed by thoughts of death and morality and, religion and heaven and hell. Overall, this kind of massive sense of impending doom. This made me really think of a kind of lesser known symptom of trauma, which is this concept of a foreshortened future. This is where, due to trauma, an individual really struggles to imagine long-term future milestones, like growing old or having relationships, creating a life that they want. And the future can feel almost abstract or unreachable. From a survival perspective, I feel like this makes sense. When your brain has had this sudden event that exposes it to the reality that life could be taken away at any moment. This is a young man whose entire understanding of safety has shifted in another way. He has survived something that should have killed him, and instead of feeling invincible, he becomes acutely aware of his own vulnerability. The tragedy is that this event reinforces what he's kind of been learning his whole childhood, that his value comes from surviving impossible things. When Gabrielle enters Lestat's room after the wolf attack. I think we see one of the most painful examples of unhealthy attachment dynamics. Lestat has just survived a near-death experience, he's absolutely traumatized, and Gabrielle doesn't really have any time for it. She is completely unmoved by his pain. Instead of meeting him emotionally and acknowledging his fear, she kind of just, she talks about the villagers, how they want to worship him. She kind of comes in with this egotism. And she almost bypasses the internal experience of what he's been through, which I feel like is very in line with what we know about Gabrielle and herself from her experiences. I feel like at this stage, Lestat doesn't really need to be told that he's extraordinary. He needs someone to recognize that he was terrified. What I do find particularly interesting is Gabrielle only really appears to be moved when Lestat starts talking about how he imagined the wolves were the rest of his family, and she shares with him that she has also had the same dream. I wouldn't necessarily say that this is kind of a lack of empathy in Gabrielle, but I will say that maybe it's that Gabrielle connects more with someone, or can connect more empathetically with someone when she understands the experience that they've been through. And through this, we see her discussing further this fantasy that she has of taking off her clothes, going into the village, taking into bed kind of any man that she comes across. And she explains this very graphically to Lestat. This is yet another nod of her trying to regain autonomy. In trying to reclaim her own sense of control, she crosses Lestat's boundaries. I would say that her graphic description of that fantasy is completely inappropriate to share with Lestat. Again, it assigns Lestat an emotional role that he should never be given. Rather than relating to him as her son, she relates to him as someone who can contain inner parts of her world that should only be held within an adult relationship. And unfortunately, it appears that the repeated violations of Gabrielle's own boundaries has distorted her relational function with Lestat. So I'm not going to describe the next things that happen in the scene, but it is genuinely heartbreaking. It really, really is. She completely continues the cycle of violence by what she does, and it takes consent and control away from Lestat. And we see the impact of this deeply, deeply confusing action where Lestat says to her, she is his. And when we return to them in the present day, it's really striking how little their relationship dynamic has actually changed. Lestat, in their kind of conversation, he confronts her about lying to him about where she was, and her response is, my maker called for his mama and I came. Well, I found this firstly disturbing but also really interesting because it highlights this constant swapping of roles, doesn't it? Mother and son, but son is the maker and the mother is the fledgling. And actually the following conversation is insight to me that Lestat does recognize that some of the behaviors in their relationship are very distressing and very unhealthy, and they're not actually something that he wants to partake in. He proposes that they maintain companionship in their relationship without the crossing of physical boundaries, and I really, really interpreted this as Lestat actually trying to put a boundary in place for himself. He's trying to separate the emotional closeness and the need for his mother away from the inappropriate aspects of their relationship. But Gabrielle's response is so concerning. I mean, she immediately shuts down his attempt to put a boundary in place. I think she says something like, we can weave a basket and fill it with bullshit. Given everything we've explored about autonomy and consent, this is so significant in the cycle of the relationship. Lestat is expressing what he is comfortable with and what he isn't, and his needs are again minimized. And there is an added element to Gabrielle that I really want to introduce to the table, and I'd be really curious to hear about your thoughts on this. When Lestat comments on him having a beautiful face, Gabrielle says that she can see herself in his face. I want to be careful here because I think the term narcissism has been used very frequently in pop culture. It's assigned to lots of different behaviors quite commonly. And although that might be a good thing, maybe we're becoming aware of, certain narcissistic cycles or behaviors, it also can be applied a bit too quickly to things that aren't actually narcissism. In addition, because I work in a trauma-informed way, we really do work from a sense of, what happened to you? What do you need, rather than what's wrong with you? And so I'm not trying to diagnose Gabrielle or suggest that she is or should be classed as a narcissist. But there are some aspects to her behavior that really bring up associations with narcissistic parenting. And again, I want to be careful how I talk about this. This is only my interpretation. When we think of a narcissistic parent, right, in the media, we think about a caregiver who maybe likes to be the center of attention, loves themselves, is very egotistical, but in a lot of cases, narcissistic parents are deeply traumatized, and the mask of, this extreme high self-esteem is actually a complete cover-up for very, very fractured and deep-rooted low self-esteem and insecurity. They erode their child's sense of identity, and rather than actually seeing their child as a separate individual, they actually see the child as an extension of themselves. And so then this child becomes a person that they can project their own insecurities on, or their own unmet needs, or their own trauma. And at times, that can look like vicariously living through their child, forcing their child to do certain kind of goals or aspirations, or live their life a certain way in order for them to feel like they're fulfilling their own desires. It might be minimizing their child's emotional world in favor of their own, teaching a child that their needs and their emotional needs aren't important and only theirs is. I mean, in the book, Gabrielle literally tells Lestat that he is the organ she didn't have. And Lestat actually has a lot of inner monologue where he recognizes that perhaps Gabrielle was living vicariously through him, when she was sending out for hunts, when she was, buying him all of that hunting equipment, even when she wouldn't teach him to read or write. I mean, these were all behaviors that were maybe put in place for Gabrielle to meet her own needs instead of prioritizing Lestat's. And again, Lestat wanted to go to the church, he wanted to be a monk, he wanted to run away with actors. I mean, he did have aspirations and aspects of his identity that were never supported by his family. And all of this, the inappropriate relationship, the crossing of boundaries, the stripping of Lestat's identity, furthers this kind of blurred enmeshment between the two and gives us so much context as to why Lestat becomes the Lestat that we know. And so there are other aspects of the episode that do require commentary. My interpretation of Lestat and Gabrielle using the strip club as a hunting ground, as well as, Gabrielle wanting them to share a victim who was engaging in intimacy. All of these are visual reminders of themes that the episode kind of keeps us coming back to, power, blurred boundaries, and the ways intimacy has become entangled with violence for both of them. When we return to my beloved Louis, when the lawyers are sitting around the table because Lestat trashed Louis' hotel, we see these attachment wounds are on full display for Lestat. Lestat becomes really anxiously preoccupied with Louis' relations with the lawyer and Armand, and his jealousy is so visual, isn't it? I bet, despite the hypocrisy of him also having relations with his lawyer and also having many, many, many relations with other people, but he is infuriated by Louis doing the same. And it really brings me back to that scene where Lestat says to Gabrielle that she is his. This replaying of behavior is deep-rooted in attachment for Lestat, where love has to be exclusive to him. The person that he chooses, the person that he wants to choose him, their love has to be exclusive for him to feel chosen. And I'd be curious to hear about your thoughts on Gabrielle towards Louis in this episode. There are moments where I felt like there was even jealousy from Gabrielle when she first sees Lestat singing to Louis, for example. I kind of have questions of is it Gabrielle recognizing that Lestat is a separate person from her? Is it that she's curious about why Lestat is so drawn to Louis? Or is it internal insecurity? She is attempting to understand what Lestat has that she never did, or what makes Louis so important. I mean, there are so many theories. I would love for some of you guys to tell me what you thought about maybe how Gabrielle feels about Louis, or, how she feels about Lestat and Louis being together. And again, I don't want to come back to narcissism, but there is evidence for me that maybe we might be pointing in that direction, because even when Gabrielle is looking at the photo of Louis, she says, "What did you tell him about me?" And I don't want to overinterpret this, but it's so interesting how quickly her attention shifts to herself. Rather than asking about Louis' character, or his connection with Lestat, or why Lestat was connected to him. She was worried about how Louis perceives her. And despite Lestat appearing to maybe still be stuck in the cycle at several moments, I think the piano scene again was a real indication that there are parts of Lestat that are trying to end this cycle and break out of unhealthy behaviors. He's singing in French and Gabrielle says to him, "Your father's tongue." And Lestat is very quick to be like, "No, my tongue." And this is again just Lestat being made to be between two parents. He's either like his mother or he's like his father. And it is just wonderful how he rebels from that. He's like, "No, I am my own person." And honestly, if anyone watching has had experiences of dysfunctional parental relationships, it is so common for parents sometimes to be like, "You're just like your dad," or "You're just like your mum." It's such an unhealthy way to almost feel like you have to pick which side you are, and one of the sides is good and one of the sides is bad. But Lestat, he is trying to reclaim his identity. He is trying to reclaim himself. And I feel like this is a massive theme for him during this show. The flashbacks also fascinated me because when he's playing the piano and we see flashbacks to him and Gabrielle, shall we say, finishing the family members, that is so different from the book. But I couldn't help but wonder if this was a choice by the writers to kind of further highlight the themes that we've been talking about. It puts a greater emphasis on Gabrielle's trauma, especially when she gets the final blow on her husband. That is deeply symbolic. That's her literally removing the individual of her oppression. And I suppose it echoes the dream that they had shared together of this allyship of the wolves being the family. And well, they finally get to complete the hunt, don't they? I mean, this evokes such a emotional response for him. He genuinely looks distressed when he's singing this song. I really interpreted that as true grief for his childhood, not just for his family. He's grieving this family, this love that he never had. And there is even a moment where you see in the flashback he's like in the tomb with his mother, and he hears the cries of the other family members finding the rest of the family. And to be honest, he almost looks sickened. It made me wonder whether, in trying to desperately preserve his connection with his mother, Lestat found himself participating in things that he actually didn't agree with or didn't actually align with his values. But because losing his attachment with his mother felt so unbearable, he kind of did them anyway. How does he really handle feeling as though he has maybe performed some things to ensure that he keeps this relationship with his mother, even though they go against his true values? Well, actually, towards the end of that scene, we hear that he is trying to validate not only the relationship with his mother, but for me, probably the experiences that have just been shown. I think he says something like, "Oh, we're vampires, it's different. She was dying." And this is a really common safety behavior in survivors of trauma. It's this aspect of bargaining or minimizing what you've been through in order to make it feel more bearable. It might sound like, well, it wasn't that bad. It could have been worse. I can't say that definitively that's what the writers were doing here, but I couldn't help but hear Lestat trying to reconcile his love for his mother and also acknowledging the irreparable harm that she has done to him. This internal conflict is such a common thing that happens after surviving trauma. And before I want to finish, I want to ground us and come back to the conversation with Louis and Daniel. Firstly, I love how Louis asks Daniel, "Are you enduring?" I love it so much. I feel like it's such a better question than just "How are you?" Because again, I think it reflects Louis's incredible ability to really empathize and to understand the complexity of living an immortal life. And also Louis, he just loves to get deep, doesn't he? He's just like that. He's an endless river. I know Daniel also mentions briefly that he feels as though he can sense Amand near him. So I'm really hoping that we come back to this in episode 3 or kind of later episodes, because I am such a big Devil's Minion fan, I cannot tell you. But really for me, it was Louis revealing his grief for Claudia. It's because he says that he sees someone that looks like her. He follows her into a diner. He kind of imagines that this is Claudia, that she's lived to adulthood. I mean, it was such a upheaval of an old grief that Louis still obviously has been carrying. But most importantly, I feel like I can hypothesize a trigger for that grief, which is going to come up, which is the fact that the Talamasca have told him that they have found Bruce. Oh my fucking god. Are we finally going to see Louis' revenge on Bruce? I will pay money to sit front row. Bruce is connected to so much of Claudia's suffering. The event that happened in season 1, Louis I genuinely interpret that Louis has always blamed himself for that. You know, he couldn't protect her from it when he let her kind of go and travel in Europe in season 1. And he could never avenge what happened to her, could he? He could never find Bruce. He could never close that chapter or close that book for Claudia. So I am genuinely excited to see what comes from that. Overall though, this episode has definitely intricately explored the devastating impact of trauma, both systemically, so within the family, and also intrapersonally, so what happens inside. We are reminded that, you know, understanding someone's trauma or what has happened to them isn't the same as excusing the harm that they go on to cause. Two things can be true at once. Gabrielle can both be deeply traumatized and profoundly harmful to Lestat. For me, this is what made episode 2 so compelling. It doesn't simplify villain or victim. Instead, it really highlighted how trauma can seep through generations, how unresolved pain can shape relationships, and how desperately some people search for safety in sometimes healthy and sometimes deeply destructive ways. As always, these are my therapeutic interpretations. Please let me know what you think of this episode. Let me know what your thoughts were and your interpretations were of episode 2. And if you'd like to join the journey, please do subscribe. I will see you for episode 3. Take care. Bye.